We're also joined by Theo Bertram, who's the director of the Social Market Foundation and a former advisor to Tony Blair and Gordon Brown in Number 10. Hello, Theo.
Hi, Hugo.
Thanks, both of you, for being with us. So, look, Mark, Rachel Reeves has said her fiscal rules are non-negotiable. She says she's got to make sure that day-to-day spending is matched by revenue in 5 years' time. Are those rules a straitjacket, or is she right to stick to them?
They are definitely a straitjacket. There's no doubt about that. The government's fiscal position is now largely set by the OBR rather than Rachel Reeves herself. And what we just heard from Norman Lamont on your news bulletin earlier, she has sailed a bit too close to the wind. So she's determined to fit into this straitjacket. She's going to have to lose a bit of weight. Now, the way she's doing that, I think, is very tactical rather than strategic. She doesn't really have an overall plan about how to get government expenditure down or make it more efficient over the long term. So what we're going to hear is some sort of salami slicing measures. You know, every government department needs to try and find 7% efficiencies. We're going to let the civil service fall through natural wastage, that kind of thing. My own view is I'd like the fiscal rules to be set by the Treasury and the government rather than by this arm's length body. I think is too much of a restriction on a Chancellor of the Exchequer, whether you approve of their agenda or not. Those are the ones elected to carry out tax and spend policy.
But then, Mark, when the Truss government, which you supported, tried sidelining the rules in the OBR, they were monstered by the markets. So doesn't the OBR perform a useful function in stopping that from usually happening?
Yeah, it's an interesting case on whether you want an independent forecaster to look through the numbers, but I'm not sure it was the sidelining of the OBR that was the principal cause of the problem. I mean, independent economic forecasters are numerous in the UK. I think there are over 31 large ones. And in terms of accuracy, I think the OBR scores 29th out of 31 on that table. So if you want somebody else to look over your homework, there are plenty of options there. And I don't think there's any particular reason on their track record alone to believe that the OBR's forecasting judgments and algorithms are particularly accurate. Indeed, they're probably worse than the average.
Theo, you've worked in Number 10 and you've had mornings like the morning they're presumably having in government right now. How will the government today try and make today sound like a positive announcement rather than an admission that Rachel Reeves is just a captive of her fiscal rules?
Yeah, I think they'll be focusing on two things. I think one will be growth, and I think the other will be the reform of public services. So I think they're really going to look for where in what she's promised is their investment going into projects that will bring growth forward in the future, and where are their public sector reforms of the type that all governments would do, and how can they frame that as not being driven by circumstance but as modernisation of public services. So I think it's a very difficult hand she's been dealt. She inherited an economy that's in a much tougher state than any other incoming government in recent times, and since then we've had the Trump tariff. So this is a really tough statement that she's going to have to deliver today.
The government's core mission, Theo, is meant to be growth. How badly is its entire agenda being undermined by the fact that growth is not turning up?
So I think they'll have to be patient on growth, and I think I don't think you're going to be judged as a government on what happens in your first 9 months. I think if they are still struggling with growth in 4 years' time, then I think that will be hugely problematic for them. They've bet the house on growth, but I don't think you need to have growth today. I think it needs to be where are they in that 4 years' time, and what their plans are all based on long-term goals. And I think one of the things we've been missing in the UK for a long time is the idea of a government that might actually focus on trying to get long-term growth rather than short-term quick fixes.
Mark, are you as forgiving on that short-term lack of growth?
Not especially, because I'm not very confident that this medium or long-term growth is going to turn up. I agree with Theo that I'd like to see politicians of all stripes take a rather longer-term view rather than get panicked about the numbers in any given quarter. But I think it's unsurprising that growth is on the floor. I don't blame the Labour government exclusively for that. The outgoing Conservative government needs to take some blame as well. But with taxes at a record peacetime high, effectively, government spending going up and up and up, and the predicted trajectory of that to go even higher because of our demographics and ageing population, public sector pension liabilities and the like, and with regulation going up and up and up, I don't think we should be surprised that the economy is flatlining. We shouldn't get too het up about whether we're in a technical recession or not, or growth is sort of plus 0.5% or minus 0.1%. But these are catastrophically disappointing numbers. And I think if you can get spending down, and somewhat on the private sector, and crucially regulation down, some supply side reform, you won't immediately turn the economy round, but you could reasonably aspire to long-term growth rates of, I don't know, 2.5%, 3%, rather than the basically 0% we're getting. That doesn't solve all of your problems by any manner or means, but my God, it hugely mitigates them, because if growth remains on the floor, the public spending that we're engaging at the moment becomes wholly unsustainable rather than largely unsustainable.
Theo, one word we've started to see floating around a lot recently is austerity. I'm sure if you did one of those sort of word counts that tells you how often it turns up in the press and the media, it would have spiked of late. How does the government avoid what they're doing at the moment being likened to the austerity of the Osborne years? And indeed, should it be likened to the austerity of the Osborne years?
Well, I think the Osborne cuts were definitely deeper. They were about 2%. And I think whereas what the government is doing is sort of a much milder level of growth rather than deeper cuts. But I think the big difference between Labour and the Conservatives in terms of their projected spending over this over this 5-year period is really what happened this year, which is the reason why we saw that increase in national insurance was so that the government could fund both the NHS and investment in public services and put money into growth, into big investment projects. So that's what we've already seen this year. So the sort of pattern is you see a slight increase, a sort of relatively big increase this year, and then pretty much flat in line with what Conservative plans would have been, or had the Conservatives been in office. So there is a difference this year, but over the longer term, it's only slightly more than the Conservatives would be spending.
Right. OK, look, Mark, before I let you both go, the Shadow Chancellor Mel Stride will be responding today to the spring statement. Do you think he'll try and sound more like Jeremy Hunt or like Kwasi Kwarteng?
I'm not sure he'll try and sound like either, because being in opposition is a rather different task to being in government. But what I hope he does is, rather than criticising each and every one of Rachel Reeves' moves, is to set out how the Conservatives would approach the problem differently. Because I'm rather with Theo. There hasn't actually been a great deal of difference in fiscal policy between the two parties, between this government and the previous one. And I think both fiscal policies are too optimistic, too hopeful that something will turn up to keep everything going. And I think Stride needs to sort of set out, well, where would the Conservatives make strategic reductions in government spending, and what sort of taxes would he particularly like to get down? So it's a response rather than his own statement, but I don't think he should be wholly negative. At some point, the Conservatives have got to start sketching out their own plan, and lunchtime today wouldn't be a bad time to start.
Mark, Theo, thank you very much indeed. That's Mark Littlewood and Theo Bertram there. Great pleasure to speak to both of you. Now let's take